I read the headline the same way you probably did, with that instinctive mix of curiosity and skepticism that comes whenever a political story promises historic rupture. Canada taking a bold action toward a former American president is the sort of phrasing that seems engineered to provoke, to suggest theater. Yet beneath that surface, beneath the adrenaline of the headline, there is a quieter and far more consequential story that most people missed. It is a story about how nations understand their own sovereignty, about the long arc of institutional development, and about what happens when a country once defined primarily by proximity to a more powerful neighbor begins to rethink what that proximity means. You saw the clips, you heard the commentary, but what you may not have seen is the deeper constitutional and economic realignment taking shape behind Canada's announcement. My task is to walk you through that hidden layer, not to amplify excitement, but to illuminate the structure beneath it. What officially happened is straightforward enough. Canada made a declaration about its economic posture that challenges long-held assumptions about North American interdependence. What struck me, and what likely struck you, even if you could not yet articulate it, was how the announcement did not sound like a negotiation or a protest. It sounded like a nation calmly redrawing the perimeter of its own decision-making. For decades, Canada's economic strategy has been understood in relation to the United States, shaped by the gravitational pull of the American market and the unpredictability of American politics. When the United States has been steady, that interdependence has been a source of prosperity. When it has been less steady, Canadians have felt the tremors. What made this moment so unusual is that Canada signaled it no longer intends to tie its long-term planning to those tremors. To understand how we arrived here, you have to consider the slow accumulation of pressures that have reshaped the incentives of modern governance. Nations rarely rethink their economic foundation spontaneously. They do it when the cost of maintaining the familiar becomes greater than the cost of building something new. The last several years have delivered a series of lessons about vulnerability, supply chains fractured, political cycles destabilized, trade policy weaponized. If you are a Canadian policymaker watching these developments, you eventually confront a question that is not ideological, but practical. Should the stability of your own citizens' livelihoods depend on political dynamics you cannot influence? That question, perhaps more than any immediate dispute, is what pushed Canada toward the moment we are discussing now. The mechanics, when you strip away the rhetoric, come down to the slow but deliberate construction of alternatives. Economic dependence is not undone by a speech. It is undone by infrastructure investment and the kind of industrial strategy that takes years to assemble. What Canada revealed is not merely a policy preference, but an institutional blueprint. It involves domestic production capacity, diversified markets, and the recognition that sovereignty is expressed not through defiant slogans, but through the quiet ability to act without waiting for permission. You might feel that this is obvious, yet it is only obvious in hindsight. Interdependence is comfortable until it is not, and institutions tend to cling to comfort until a shock forces them to reconsider. Which brings us to responsibility. It is tempting to attribute every shift in North American economic relations to the personality of a single American leader. And certainly the volatility of recent administrations played a role in sharpening Canada's resolve. But institutions respond to incentives, not personalities. When a country, especially a large one, adopts a posture of unpredictability, its partners look not at the individual, but at the system that allows such unpredictability to become policy. Canadians saw a pattern, not an outburst. They saw a political environment in the United States that could swing dramatically from one election to the next. And they asked themselves whether a nation of their size, with their aspirations, could afford to be carried along by those swings. The answer, increasingly, was no. Yet the consequences of this decision extend far beyond the realm of trade. They touch on how democratic societies navigate uncertainty, how they balance openness with resilience, and how citizens make sense of a world in which economic security is no longer guaranteed by geography. You may not work in manufacturing or forestry or housing, but the institutions that govern those sectors shape the civic life you inhabit. When a nation reorganizes its economic foundations, it inevitably reorganizes the expectations of its people. Canada is signaling that the old assumption that the United States is the fixed point around which the Canadian economy orbits may no longer hold. Whether you agree with that shift or not, it is a significant recalibration of democratic self-standing. The human element is easy to overlook when conversations drift into the language of systems and sovereignty. But behind every policy choice are workers, households, and communities who depend on stability. For them, this shift is not an abstract gesture of national confidence. It is a bet on a future that feels more controllable than the one offered by continued dependence. Some will see it as overdue. Others will worry it introduces new risks. Both reactions are understandable. Nations like people navigate trade-offs. I want to leave you for now with a reflection that sits above the political fray. This moment reveals the tension at the heart of modern governance, the desire for autonomy in a world built on interdependence. Canada is not rejecting interdependence. It is renegotiating its terms. And it is doing so at a time when many democracies are reconsidering how to protect themselves from volatility without isolating themselves from opportunity. That balance is difficult, and no single announcement resolves it. But this is one of those inflection points where you can sense the architecture of a political order shifting, even if the finishing touches are years away. As we step further into the mechanics of this shift, I want you to picture something less dramatic than a diplomatic showdown and far more consequential. A nation quietly adjusting the gears of its own economic machinery. That is what Canada has begun to do. Not by declaring a rupture, but by designing a system that reduces the need for one. If you think about institutions the way I often encourage you to, slow-moving, inertia-bound, shaped more by incentives than by impulses, you begin to see why this moment carries such weight. Canada is not walking away from the United States. It is walking toward a version of itself that does not rely on the goodwill or predictability of a larger neighbor. And that distinction, though subtle, is the entire story. What enabled this, and what is still enabling it, is a confluence of long-term trends that make institutional recalibration not only possible, but prudent. You see it in the fragility of global supply chains, in the politicization of trade policy, in the way economic stability now hinges on political temperament more than on traditional economic fundamentals. When volatility becomes predictable, institutions adapt. For Canada, adaptation meant treating the United States not as an adversary, but as a variable, one that can no longer serve as the fixed anchor of national planning. You might feel that such realism borders on pessimism. Yet, it is actually an act of institutional maturity. Democracies that endure learn to insulate themselves from the emotional turbulence of politics, both domestic and foreign. The actors involved in this transformation are not only elected leaders, though their rhetoric often draws the spotlight. Behind them are economists, civil servants, industry experts, and planners who have spent years thinking about how to build a more resilient economic foundation. These are the people who look at trends rather than news cycles, who understand that dependence on a single market creates not only economic but psychological vulnerability. If you rely too heavily on one partner, every shift in their behavior becomes existential. Canada's pivot is at its core an effort to remove the existential element from its economic relationship with the United States. It is a way of saying that friendship is valuable, but reliance is dangerous. This realignment also forces us to confront an uncomfortable but necessary truth about modern governance. Nations are increasingly responsible for building their own buffers against external shocks. That responsibility cannot be delegated to goodwill or habit. It must be engineered. Canada has begun to engineer it by expanding domestic capacity, cultivating alternative markets, and framing national strategy around the assumption that predictability must come from within. The United States is not being punished. It is being recalibrated from the assumed center of gravity to a partner among several. You may find that reframing unsettling or refreshing, depending on your perspective. But either way, it reflects the logic of a world where alliances are still valuable, but no longer sufficient. The consequences of this shift reach beyond trade and politics into the daily experience of civic life. When a country asserts this level of economic independence, it reshapes the expectations of its citizens. It tells them that security will not be outsourced to diplomatic relations or inherited from geography. It must be built. And for many viewers like you, who are accustomed to thinking of international relationships as largely stable, this can feel like the ground quietly moving beneath your feet. Yet, this movement is not a collapse. It is an adjustment, a recognition that stability must be manufactured deliberately, in an era when instability is the most reliable trend. At the same time, we should acknowledge how this transformation reflects broader structural issues facing democracies everywhere. Polarization, institutional fatigue, and the erosion of shared assumptions have made long-term planning more difficult in many countries. Canada's strategy is, in a sense, an attempt to carve out a zone of predictability within that wider uncertainty. It reveals something about the nature of sovereignty in the 21st century, that it is less about borders and more about capacity. The ability to act, to plan, to invest, to adjust. These are the modern expressions of national independence. They are also reminders that sovereignty is not a posture, but a practice. If you find yourself wondering whether this moment marks a turning point for North America, you are asking the right question. Institutions evolve slowly, but sometimes there are moments when their trajectory becomes visible in a new way. This is one of those moments. Canada is not abandoning its partnership with the United States. It is redefining it. And in doing so, it challenges all of us to rethink how alliances persist. Not through dependence, but through choice. As this evolution unfolds, it becomes increasingly important to look at the incentives that shaped it, because incentives offer a clearer explanation than ideology ever could. Nations respond to pressure points, and Canada has experienced several in recent years that would force any responsible government to assess its vulnerabilities. The unpredictability of American trade policy was one of those points, but it was not the only one. Shifting global demand, the need for climate-resilient industries, and the pressures of domestic affordability all converged to create a moment when maintaining the inherited model of dependence was no longer the safer choice. And you, as a citizen, observing this from the outside, might recognize that such choices rarely happen at the moment of crisis. They happen after years of observing the same pattern and realizing the pattern has become the problem. That is why when Canada announced its shift, it did not sound reactive. It sounded prepared. Preparedness is the hallmark of institutional seriousness. And it is worth pausing to appreciate what that means in practice. It means that behind the scenes, planners were mapping out supply chains that could withstand political turbulence. It means they were modeling scenarios in which American markets were not hostile, but simply unreliable. It means they were crafting policies that could win public support, not by invoking nationalism, but by articulating the rational desire for stability. When you view the moment through that lens, it stops looking like a bold departure and starts looking like the natural culmination of years of structural reconsideration. This clarity also allows us to look more honestly at the role of the United States. It is tempting to view American economic power as an immutable fact of North American life. Yet power that rests on the assumption of dependence is more fragile than it appears. The United States has long benefited from being the default destination for its neighbors' exports, talent, and investment. But defaults are not eternal. They persist only as long as they remain mutually advantageous. Canada's recalibration does not diminish America. Rather, it exposes a truth the United States has not always acknowledged. That influence derived from unpredictability is self-defeating. It invites partners to search for alternatives, and when alternatives are found, influence fades. For the viewer trying to understand why this matters beyond the abstractions of geopolitics, consider how deeply intertwined economic predictability is with your everyday civic expectations. When institutions are stable, you plan with confidence. When they are unstable, you hesitate. Nations behave the same way. They invest, build, and strategize based on their expectations of one another. If those expectations become erratic, even the closest partnerships begin to shift. Canada's new posture is, at its core, an effort to restore predictability by relocating it internally. And in doing so, it underscores a principle that democracies often forget. Autonomy is not the opposite of cooperation. Autonomy is what makes cooperation durable. We also cannot overlook the human dimension, because grand strategy often masks the quieter story unfolding in people's lives. Workers in vulnerable industries are not reading white papers or tracking diplomatic trends. They are making decisions about careers, mortgages, and futures. They are the ones who feel the tremors when markets wobble or when trade agreements are revised without warning. Canada's approach acknowledges that vulnerability and attempts to reduce it by broadening the country's economic base. It is not a promise to shield every job from global forces. That would be unrealistic. But it is a recognition that resilience must be built at the level where people actually live. When seen from a wider vantage point, this moment exposes something significant about the health of democratic institutions in general. Democracies thrive when their systems are flexible enough to adapt without breaking. They falter when they cling to arrangements long after those arrangements cease to serve the public good. Canada's shift, then, is not just a reaction to American volatility, but a demonstration of democratic adaptability. It shows that institutions, when functioning properly, can recognize their own structural vulnerabilities and adjust before they become crises. And that, I suspect, is one of the deeper reasons this moment has captured so much attention. It is not only about Canada and the United States. It is about whether modern democracies can still make long-term decisions in a short-term political world. As I continue, I want you to keep one question in mind. What does it mean for a nation to grow into its own economic identity? Because that question sits at the center of everything unfolding here, and it will guide the next part of our discussion. As we trace the arc of this development toward its conclusion, the question I left you with begins to take on sharper definition. What does it mean for a nation to grow into its own economic identity? In many ways, it means recognizing that geography is not destiny, and that history, while instructive, does not dictate the future. Canada has long been described as a middle power, a nation whose fortunes rose or fell in tandem with the decisions made south of its border. That description was never entirely accurate, but it persisted because it offered a convenient framework through which to understand continental politics. Now, however, Canada is rewriting that framework. Not through bravado, not through rupture, but through the patient construction of a system that allows it to stand upright in a world that does not reward dependence. As you consider the broader implications, it becomes clear that this shift marks more than a change in economic strategy. It marks a maturation of political philosophy. For generations, Canada navigated its relationship with the United States with a predictable blend of cooperation, caution, and compromise. That posture served both countries well in many contexts. But it also created blind spots, assumptions that did not age well in an era defined by volatility. When a nation begins to see that the stabilizing force it once relied upon is no longer as stable, it must choose between nostalgia and adaptation. Canada has chosen adaptation, and in doing so, it demonstrates something valuable about institutional resilience, that sovereignty is not a shield one raises against the world, but a set of capacities one builds to participate in it on equal footing. This evolution also challenges the United States to reflect on its own posture, though that reflection is not guaranteed. For too long, American influence relied on the belief that its neighbors had no practical alternatives. But the world changes, and so do incentives. When unpredictability becomes a governing strategy, even allies begin to diversify. If this moment carries a lesson for the United States, it is that leadership grounded in stability invites partnership, while leadership grounded in volatility invites recalculation. Canada has recalculated, not out of hostility, but out of prudence. And prudence, especially in geopolitics, is often the quiet force that shapes history more profoundly than confrontation ever could. But let us bring this down from the level of nations to the level where you live your civic life. Why does any of this matter to you? It matters because the stability of institutions, whether domestic or international, affects the choices available to individuals. It affects whether jobs are secure, whether markets are predictable, whether governments can plan beyond the next election cycle. When a country strengthens its economic footing, it indirectly strengthens the footing of its citizens. And when countries across the world begin to rethink how they manage uncertainty, it signals a wider shift in the expectations that democracies place on themselves. You, as a participant in your own democratic system, benefit from understanding these dynamics because they shape the world you inhabit. Even if you never think about trade policy or supply chains, the human impact remains at the center of all of this. Canada's strategy is not a theoretical exercise. It is a response to the anxieties of real communities whose economic ties to the United States have often felt like both lifelines and liabilities. Those communities deserve institutions that plan for their future rather than reacting to someone else's political cycle. And in recognizing that responsibility, Canada is demonstrating a form of leadership that is quieter than confrontation, but more durable than rhetoric. It is leadership rooted in the belief that citizens deserve predictability in a world defined by uncertainty. Pulling back one final time, I want to emphasize what this episode reveals about the broader condition of democratic governance. We often imagine democracy as a system built on ideals, and it is. But it is also a system built on infrastructure, coordination, and the ability to act coherently in a competitive world. When democracies adapt thoughtfully, they display their strength. When they cling to outdated arrangements, they expose their fragility. Canada's pivot may not resolve every challenge it faces, but it reflects a seriousness about governance that many democracies struggle to maintain in an age of constant political churn. And so we arrive at the end of this topic with a clearer sense of what has actually happened. Not a confrontation between neighbors, not a rupture in the continental order, but a recalibration grounded in confidence rather than fear. Canada is not declaring independence from the United States. It is declaring independence from uncertainty. And in doing so, it offers a model for how nations might navigate a world where the old assumptions about stability no longer apply. You may agree with this approach, or question its feasibility, but either way, it invites reflection on what genuine sovereignty looks like in the modern age. As always, I leave you with a question rather than an answer. What do you believe true national independence requires in a world where stability must be built rather than inherited? Your answer to that question shapes not only how you view this moment, but how you understand your own role as a citizen in strengthening the institutions you rely on. If you found this discussion helpful, I invite you to subscribe, comment, or share your perspective. The more we think together about the forces shaping our democracies, the stronger our civic life becomes.